The blow landed without ceremony, without hesitation, without a single witness to protest. Admiral Victor Harrington didn't pause to consider protocol, didn't announce his intentions, didn't offer Lieutenant Commander Elena Thorne a moment to defend herself. His knuckles struck her cheek in the suffocating quiet of the secured briefing chamber at Crimson Bay Naval Command. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel sealing a verdict that had never seen trial. She didn't cry out. She didn't stumble backward. She didn't even flinch. What she did was infinitely more dangerous. She smiled. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Admiral Harrington couldn't have known as pain shot through his hand from the impact was that the woman standing before him wasn't just another subordinate officer who dared to question his authority. She wasn't some desk-bound analyst who'd grown too comfortable with her security clearance. And she definitely wasn't the type of person who absorbed violence and walked away in silence. What she was someone who'd spent the last decade in locations that existed only in classified files, completing missions that required a very different kind of authorization entirely. By the time Admiral Harrington's two personal security officers registered the sharp crack of knuckles against flesh and began their instinctive movement toward the disturbance, Lieutenant Commander Thorne had already calculated the exact distance between Harrington's exposed solar plexus and her right elbow. By the time they'd taken their second step into the room, she had already identified the precise pressure point beneath his left ear that would send him crashing to the polished marble floor. And by the time their hands moved toward their standard-issue sidearms, Admiral Victor Harrington was unconscious on the deck of Crimson Bay's most secure briefing facility. 3 seconds. Not one person in that room, not the security detail, not the surveillance equipment, not even Harrington himself had seen exactly how a decorated 3-star admiral had been neutralized in under 3 seconds by someone half his size. Now, before we reveal the surgical precision of the technique that left a career military officer unconscious faster than most people can blink, and the words Lieutenant Commander Thorne spoke that made his elite bodyguards freeze with their weapons halfway drawn, drop us a comment predicting what you think happened when Admiral Harrington finally regained consciousness. Smash that like button if you believe some people need to learn the hard way. That rank doesn't grant you permission to lay hands on anyone. And hit subscribe because today's story proves that sometimes the most lethal person in the room is the one everyone assumes is helpless. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, to understand why a decorated officer would assault a subordinate in a secured facility, and why that decision would prove to be the worst mistake of his 32-year career, we need to rewind the clock. 72 hours earlier. The morning air at the shooting range outside Portland, Maine, carried the bite of late autumn, the kind of cold that settled into your bones and reminded you that winter was coming, whether you were ready or not. The private facility sat 20 miles inland from Crimson Bay Naval Command Center, hidden among dense pine forests that had witnessed 2 centuries of American history unfold beneath their branches. The crack of rifle fire split the silence with metronomic precision, every 2 seconds. No variation, no hesitation. Lieutenant Commander Elena Thorne lowered the M110 semi-automatic sniper system, her breathing controlled, and even despite the physical exertion of maintaining perfect form for the last 40 minutes. The weapon was familiar in her hands, not the lightweight precision instrument civilians imagined when they thought of military firearms, but a brutally efficient tool weighing nearly 16 pounds fully loaded. At the observation post 70 yards behind her position, a man watched through high-powered optics designed for spotting an artillery fall. He didn't need them to know what he was seeing. He'd trained enough operators over 4.5 decades to recognize genuine talent when it manifested. Retired Colonel James Blackwood was 72 years old, and his body carried the accumulated damage of a career that had begun in the frozen hell of Korea and stretched through every Cold War brushfire from Berlin to Cuba. His hands bore the distinctive scars of frostbite suffered during a winter reconnaissance mission in 1952 that officially never happened. His left knee was reconstructed titanium and optimism, courtesy of a parachute malfunction over East Germany in 1963 that absolutely positively never occurred. But his eyes were sharp as the day he'd first looked through a rifle scope at 19 years old, and what they saw now made something old and familiar stir in his chest. Pride, yes, but also concern. Elena fired her final round, then executed the clearing procedure with the automatic precision that separated professionals from amateurs. Magazine out, chamber check, visual inspection. Only then did she engage the safety and rise from her prone position with the fluid economy of movement that Blackwood had spent years drilling into his students. 40 rounds, Blackwood said as she approached the observation post. His voice carried this gravel of too many years breathing cordite and cigarette smoke. 40 hits. You know what that tells me? Elena set the rifle on the cleaning table with the careful reverence the weapon deserved. That I haven't lost my edge, sir. It tells me you're nervous. Blackwood stood with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned to negotiate with his body rather than command it. You never shoot perfect when you're relaxed. When you're comfortable, you push yourself. Take risks. Test limits. Perfect scores mean you're playing it safe. She met his eyes without flinching. They were the color of winter ice, and they'd seen things that would break most people's minds. But they'd also seen her at her worst and never looked away. Operation starts in 72 hours, she said simply. Operation. Blackwood's mouth twisted around the word like he was tasting something bitter. That's what we're calling it when we send one of our own into the kill zone with nothing but a recording device and a prayer. I'll have more than that, sir. I'll have 12 years of your training. My training kept me alive in places where the enemy wore different uniforms and spoke different languages. He moved to the rifle, began the disassembly process with hands that remembered the sequence even when his mind was occupied elsewhere. Victor Harrington wears the same uniform you do, speaks the same language, swore the same oath, which makes what he's done worse. Elena's voice carried an edge now sharp enough to cut. He knew better. He knows the rules. He just doesn't think they apply to him. Blackwood finished breaking down the rifle, laying each component on the cleaning cloth with geometric precision. Tell me about Montenegro. The subject change was deliberate, and Elena recognized the technique. Blackwood never lectured. He asked questions and let you find your own answers. It was infuriating and effective in equal measure. Colonel Viktor Markov, she recited, pulling the memory forward. Serbian intelligence officer, decorated veteran commander of Special Operations Unit outside Podgorica. Used his position to sexually assault female subordinates over a period of 8 years. Local military police refused to investigate. Chain of command protected him. And 3 years ago, JSOC inserted me under deep cover as a liaison officer. I documented his pattern, collected evidence, and when he attempted to assault me in his private office, I defended myself. Defended yourself. Blackwood's tone was neutral, but his eyes were measuring. That's one way to describe putting a man in the hospital for 3 weeks. He recovered fully. No permanent damage. Elena's voice remained level. He also never touched another female officer again. Last I heard, he became quite vocal about the importance of protecting subordinates from predatory authority figures. Fear is an excellent teacher. Blackwood began cleaning the rifle bolt with methodical precision. But it's a temporary lesson. Fear fades. Harrington won't just be afraid, Elena. He'll be destroyed, career over, reputation demolished. Everything he's built for 32 years turned to ash. You ready for that weight? Elena was silent for a long moment, watching the morning light filter through the pine branches. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out a harsh primal sound that belonged to a world far older than military protocol or human justice. Commander Patricia Ashford requested transfer from Harrington's command 6 months ago, she said quietly. She was 42 years old, 20 years of exemplary service, top of her field in signals intelligence. She asked to be reassigned to a listening post in the Aleutian Islands, rather than spend another day under his authority. Blackwood nodded slowly. I read her file. Lieutenant Kate Sullivan, 29, fast-tracked for command. 3 months ago, during a joint training exercise, Harrington created a private briefing opportunity. She filed a complaint. It disappeared. 2 weeks later, she was transferred to a logistics position in Norfolk. Desk job, her career effectively over. I read that file too. 4 more women, same pattern, isolated locations, disabled surveillance, explicit threats about career consequences if they spoke up. Elena's hands had curled into fists without her conscious awareness. She forced them to relax. And those are just the ones who were willing to talk to NCIS agent Kincaid. How many others, Colonel? How many women just disappeared from the service because they couldn't fight back? So this is about justice. This is about making sure it doesn't happen again. Blackwood set down the cleaning rod, his weathered hands still for the first time since they'd begun talking. You know what they taught me in Korea? They taught me that righteous anger is a weapon, but it's also a liability. Makes you predictable. Makes you take risks you shouldn't take. I'm not angry, sir. I'm focused. You're both, and that's exactly why you might succeed. He reached into his jacket, withdrew a manila envelope worn soft with handling. NCIS Special Agent Marcus Kincaid compiled this. 6 victims willing to testify. Patterns documented over 4 years. Transfer requests, medical records, counseling reports. Everything except the one thing that actually matters in a military court. Elena took the envelope, felt its weight. Hard evidence of the assault itself. Video, audio, medical documentation showing injuries consistent with recent trauma. Without that, Harrington's lawyers will shred every witness. They'll paint these women as disgruntled officers with axes to grind. They'll suggest coordination and conspiracy, and a military jury looking at a 3-star admiral with 32 years of decorated service will want to believe him. Which is why I'm going in. Which is why you're going to let a flag officer assault you in a secured facility with the hope that you can document it before he does permanent damage. Blackwood's voice hardened. You understand what that means. You're not going into hostile one territory where you can shoot your way out. You're walking into an American naval installation and deliberately provoking a superior officer to commit a felony assault. And if anything goes wrong, if the recording device fails, if he's smarter than we think, if his security detail reacts faster than anticipated, your career is over, and Harrington walks away. I know the risks. Do you? He moved closer, and now Elena could see the full weight of his 72 years. I've sent good people into bad situations for 45 years. Some came home, some didn't. But I always sent them against external enemies. This is different. You're going after our own, and if you succeed, you'll be a hero to some and a traitor to others. The Brotherhood protects its own Elena, even the ones who don't deserve protection. Then the Brotherhood needs to learn a new lesson. Blackwood studied her face, reading the determination that had carried her through 12 years of operations that would never appear in any official record. Finally, he nodded. All right then, let's talk about Delta 7. He pulled a tablet from his bag, called up architectural blueprints that were technically classified but had somehow found their way into his possession. Elena didn't ask how. After 45 years in special operations, Blackwood had sources that would never appear on any organizational chart. Conference Room Delta 7 sits on the 7th floor of Building 7 at Crimson Bay Naval Command Center. His finger traced the layout with the precision of someone who'd studied countless tactical environments. Officially designated for compartmented briefings requiring absolute privacy. Unofficially, it's where careers get shaped and reshaped. Soundproof. More than that, the walls are lined with acoustic dampening materials disguised as artwork. Electromagnetic shielding prevents any external surveillance. The door is reinforced steel with a biometric lock system. When it's secured from inside, it would take a breaching charge to get through. Or Harrington's command code, which he'll use after dismissing his aide and locking down the room. He's done it before. Blackwood zoomed in on the door placement. Master Chief Tobias Garrett and Petty Officer First Class Devin Marshall are his personal security detail. Both stationed outside when Harrington's in private meetings. Both excellent at their jobs. How excellent? Garrett's 52, 24 years protecting flag officers. Served protection details in Iraq, Afghanistan, and half a dozen embassy assignments. Fast reaction time. Superior situational awareness. Garrett's the kind of professional who thinks 3 steps ahead. Blackwood met her eyes. He'll breach that door the second he hears signs of struggle. You'll have maybe 5 seconds from the time Harrington makes physical contact to when Garrett's inside with weapon drawn. 5 seconds. Elena ran the math calculating action sequences against that timeline. That's tight. It's impossible if you wait for him to fully commit to the assault. You need to be ready the instant he touches you. But if you move too early, if you defend yourself before he's clearly initiated violence, the recording becomes ambiguous. His lawyers will claim you overreacted to innocent contact. So I need to let him hit me. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. I've asked a lot from the people I've trained over the years, but I've never asked anyone to stand there and take a punch from someone they could easily stop. It's not about what I can stop, sir. It's about what I can prove. That's the problem with fighting our own monsters, Elena. The rules that protect them also tie your hands. He closed the tablet. Harrington's 64 years old, 6'2", around 210 pounds. Spent most of his career behind desks, but he maintains basic fitness standards. His file shows some hand-to-hand training from his academy days, but nothing recent. Against an untrained opponent, his size and aggression would be overwhelming. Against someone with Tier 1 operator training, you could put him down in 3 seconds if you wanted to. The question is whether you'll get the chance before Garrett intervenes. Blackwood pulled out another document. This is the recording device. Ceramic composite construction undetectable by standard security screening. Activated by voice command or manual trigger. Satellite uplink provides real-time transmission to secure servers monitored by Kincaid's NCIS team and JSOC oversight. Elena examined the device. Smaller than a lipstick tube, matte black, utterly unremarkable. Battery life. 8 hours continuous operation. More than enough for whatever happens in that room. The transmission is encrypted military grade. Even if Harrington somehow discovers the device, the data's already preserved off-site. Does he know that recording him might be legal? Your authorization from JSOC includes exemption from standard consent requirements when documenting criminal activity by senior military personnel. It's legal, it's admissible, and it's going to be the nail in his coffin. Blackwood's voice dropped lower, but only if you survive the encounter intact enough to testify. I've survived worse than Victor Harrington. You've survived foreign nationals in hostile territory where the gloves were off. This is different. Harrington's an American officer in an American facility. You defend yourself too aggressively, and you become the aggressor in the official narrative. You don't defend yourself enough. He left the sentence unfinished. Elena understood what he wasn't saying. The balance between documentation and survival was razor thin. Too much force and she'd face charges herself. Too little and Harrington might inflict damage that no recording could justify. Walk me through the approach, she said. For the next hour, they rehearsed scenarios. Blackwood played Harrington, demonstrating the patterns documented in victim testimonies. The gradual escalation from professional conversation to personal intimidation. The invasion of physical space. The proprietary touch disguised as professional contact. The moment when pretense dropped and aggression became explicit. Elena practiced responses, calibrating her reactions to stay within legal boundaries while maintaining defensive readiness. It was like learning a new language, where every word had to be precisely chosen or the entire meaning collapsed. Remember, Blackwood said as they concluded the training, Harrington's done this before. He's refined his approach over years. He knows how to isolate victims psychologically before the physical assault begins. He'll make you doubt yourself, question whether what's happening is really happening. That's part of his weapon system. I won't doubt. No, you won't, because you're not his usual victim. You're a weapon he doesn't know exists. Blackwood's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile under different circumstances. But he's going to learn. They packed the equipment in silence, the morning's training session complete. The rifle was cleaned and cased. The targets were collected and would be burned. No record of this meeting would exist in any official capacity. Even the shell casings had been policed, leaving no forensic trace of their presence. As Elena prepared to leave, Blackwood placed a hand on her shoulder. The gesture was uncharacteristic enough to make her pause. 45 years I've been doing this, he said quietly. Trained hundreds of operators. Sent them into situations where success meant coming home alive and failure meant flag-draped coffins. I've made peace with that calculus. But this is different, Elena. This time I'm sending someone I care about into a situation where the enemy wears our uniform and the battlefield is supposed to be safe. Colonel, let me finish. His grip tightened slightly. If things go sideways, if Harrington's smarter or faster or more dangerous than we anticipate, I want you to know that your safety matters more than the mission. more than justice for his victims, more than institutional reform. You get yourself out alive, whatever it takes. Understood. Elena met his ice blue eyes and saw genuine fear there. Not for himself, but for her. It was the closest thing to fatherly concern she'd experienced since her own father had died when she was 16. I understand, sir, but I'm not walking away. Didn't think you would. He released her shoulder and the moment of vulnerability passed. You've got 72 hours. Use them wisely. Review the files. Memorize the facility layout. Run through every scenario until the responses are automatic. Because when Harrington makes his move, you won't have time to think. I'll be ready. I know you will. That's what worries me. Elena drove back toward Crimson Bay as the afternoon light began its slow fade toward evening. The forests of Maine stretched endlessly on either side of the two-lane highway, dark and deep and older than the republic they served. Somewhere in those woods, men had fought and died in wars that predated the nation's founding. Blood had soaked into this soil for centuries, and it would again. But this time the fight wouldn't be against foreign enemies or ancient grudges. This time the enemy was institutional rot that had been permitted to grow unchecked because nobody had been willing to take the risk of cutting it out. Until now. She thought about Commander Ashford choosing exile in the Aleutian Islands over fighting back. She thought about Lieutenant Sullivan watching her fast-track career derail because she'd dared to report assault. She thought about 4 other women whose names she knew, and countless others whose stories had been buried so deeply they might never surface. And she thought about Victor Harrington walking the halls of Crimson Bay Naval Command Center with the absolute confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences for his actions, who'd learned over 32 years that his rank was armor and his authority was weapon, and the system would protect him no matter what he did. That confidence was going to be his downfall. Elena spent the next 48 hours in preparation that bordered on obsessive. She reviewed the facility schematics until she could navigate Crimson Bay blindfolded. She memorized Garrett's patrol patterns and timing. She studied Harrington's schedule, his habits, his preferences. She learned that he took coffee at 0730 every morning, black from the officers' mess on the 5th floor. That he preferred to conduct sensitive meetings mid-morning when the building was busy enough to mask unusual activity, but quiet enough to ensure privacy. That he always dismissed his aide before beginning the conversations that would evolve into assaults. She practiced with a recording device until activation became muscle memory. Voice command, archive protocol engage. Manual trigger pressure point on the side that required deliberate action, but could be executed one-handed. She tested the transmission range, confirmed the satellite uplink, verified that Agent Kincaid's monitoring team could receive clear audio from inside Delta 7's electromagnetic shielding. She ran combat scenarios in her apartment, visualizing Harrington's size and reach, calculating response timelines, drilling defensive techniques, until her body ached with exhaustion. She practiced the blood choke on a training dummy, measuring pressure and duration. 3 to 7 seconds to unconsciousness if applied correctly, too much pressure or too long, and she risked permanent brain damage. Not enough, and Harrington would remain a threat. The margin for error was non-existent. On the final night before the operation, Elena stood in her apartment, looking at her dress uniform, laid out with mathematical precision. Every ribbon positioned exactly. Every crease sharp enough to draw blood. Everything regulation perfect for someone with her exemplary service record. But underneath the pressed fabric and polished brass, she was something else entirely. Something that the uniform couldn't quite contain. Something that men like Harrington never saw coming because they'd been trained not to look for threats that wore the same uniform they did. Her phone buzzed, a text from Blackwood. Last chance to walk away. Nobody would think less of you. She typed her response carefully. If I walk away, he does this to someone else. Someone who can't fight back. That's not acceptable, sir. The reply came immediately. Figured you'd say that. Make him regret every choice that led to this moment. Yes, sir. Elena set the phone down and moved to her window. Crimson Bay Naval Command Center was visible in the distance, its lights reflecting off the Atlantic Ocean like a constellation brought down to Earth. Somewhere in that fortress of concrete and classified secrets, Victor Harrington was finishing his evening routine, completely unaware that the next 72 hours of his career had already been calculated and planned. He thought he was the hunter. He was about to learn he'd been prey all along. The morning of the operation arrived with cold rain and gray skies. Elena dressed in her uniform with the same calm precision she'd used to load a weapon or set an explosive charge. Each button fastened with deliberate care, each movement economical and purposeful. She affixed the recording device inside her uniform jacket, positioned where it would capture audio clearly but remain undetectable during normal interaction. The weight was negligible, but she felt it like a talisman. Evidence, proof, justice in ceramic and circuitry. The drive to Crimson Bay took 20 minutes through morning traffic. Elena used the time to center herself, employing breathing techniques Blackwood had taught her years ago. 4-count inhale, 7-count hold, 8-count exhale. Repeat until the nervous system settled and the mind achieved clarity. She wasn't afraid of Harrington. Fear was for people who didn't understand what they were facing. Elena understood perfectly. She'd studied him like an entomologist examining a particularly destructive beetle. She knew his patterns, his vulnerabilities, his psychological architecture. What she felt wasn't fear, it was anticipation. Security at Crimson Bay was thorough but routine. She cleared these checkpoints hundreds of times. Her credentials were impeccable. Her clearance was beyond question. The guards waved her through with professional courtesy, never suspecting that the officer they were admitting was carrying documentation that would destroy one of their own. The elevator to the 7th floor required 2 security cards and a biometric scan. The system logged her entry with timestamp precision 0847 hours, 13 minutes before her scheduled meeting with Admiral Harrington. The hallway was empty. Wednesday morning, most officers were in briefings on lower floors. The isolation was expected, but it still sent a whisper of awareness down her spine. This was deliberate. Harrington had arranged the timing and location with predatory precision. Master Chief Tobias Garrett stood outside conference room Delta 7, his posture parade ground perfect, but his eyes continuously scanning. Elena recognized the professional assessment as she approached. He was cataloging her appearance, her demeanor, her body language, looking for threats or irregularities. She gave him nothing to find, just another officer reporting for a routine briefing. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, Garrett acknowledged with a crisp nod. Master Chief? Elena stopped at the appropriate distance, maintaining professional spacing. The Admiral is expecting me. Yes, ma'am. He asked that you wait here for a moment while he concludes a secure call. Garrett's tone was neutral, but Elena caught the micro-expression that flashed across his face. Discomfort, perhaps concern. He knows something is wrong, she thought. He's been standing guard while Harrington ruins careers, and some part of him recognizes the pattern, even if he's never acknowledged it consciously. The door opened, and Lieutenant Commander Ryan Whitmore emerged. Harrington's aide was 38, efficient, and utterly loyal to his patron. He'd facilitated these meetings before. He knew what happened behind closed doors, and he'd chosen institutional advancement over moral courage. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, the Admiral will see you now. Whitmore's smile didn't reach his eyes. He was already moving past her, creating distance, making sure he wouldn't be present for what came next. Elena entered conference room Delta 7. The space was exactly as Blackwood's schematics had shown. Mahogany paneling that absorbed sound and created the impression of old money and established power. A massive conference table that dominated the center, surrounded by leather chairs that had probably cost more than her monthly salary. And behind an imposing desk, Admiral Victor Harrington. He was 64 years old, silver-haired and square-shouldered, wearing his 3 stars with the casual authority of someone who'd worn them so long they'd become part of his identity. His uniform was immaculate. His posture was perfect. And his eyes held the particular coldness that Elena had learned to recognize in predators who wore respectable faces. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, please have a seat. His voice was commanding without being loud, the tone of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. Elena sat, positioning herself where the recording device would have optimal audio capture. Sir, I received your summons regarding overseas intelligence protocols. Yes, I've been reviewing your latest mission report. Harrington picked up a tablet, made a show of scrolling through documents. I have some concerns about your tactical recommendations. And so it began. For the first 10 minutes, the conversation remained superficially professional. Harrington asked questions about intelligence gathering procedures. Elena provided answers backed by operational experience that clearly exceeded his own. She watched him bristle each time she referenced specific tactical situations that he couldn't have understood without direct exposure. This was the test. Harrington needed to feel his authority challenged, needed to feel disrespected. It fed the psychology that justified what came next. Elena gave him exactly what he needed. With respect, Admiral, that approach would have compromised operational security in the field environment I described. Her tone was professional but firm, not insubordinate but absolutely refusing to defer to his judgment when she knew better. Harrington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lieutenant Commander, I've been reviewing intelligence protocols since before you graduated from the academy. Yes, sir, but reviewing protocols from a desk in Norfolk isn't the same as implementing them in active theater. She let the implication hang there. Your experience is theoretical. Mine is practical. You're out of your depth, and we both know it. The temperature in this room dropped 10 degrees. Harrington stood slowly moving with deliberate purpose around the desk. Elena tracked his movement with peripheral vision while maintaining outward focus on her tablet. He was establishing dominance through physical positioning. Classic predator behavior. You know what your problem is, Thorne? His voice had lost the veneer of professional courtesy. You think that because you've got some overseas experience, because you've got a few commendations on your chest, you can speak to a superior officer like we're equals. He stopped directly beside her chair, close enough that she could smell coffee on his breath, close enough that his proximity became a form of intimidation. But we're not equals, Lieutenant Commander. Not even close. Elena felt her training snap into place like armor locking around her body. Every muscle relaxed, every sense sharpened. The recording device was active, capturing every word, transmitting in real time to Agent Kincaid's team and Colonel Blackwood's monitoring station. She stood carefully maintaining professional distance. Admiral, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we should continue this discussion with your aide present. There's no misunderstanding. Harrington moved closer, invading her space with deliberate aggression. And there's no rescheduling. You see, Lieutenant Commander, respect isn't something you get to negotiate. It's something you give, whether you want to or not. His hand shot out and gripped her shoulder fingers, pressing down with proprietary weight that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with establishing ownership. Sometimes when junior officers forget their place, senior officers need to remind them exactly where they stand in the chain of command. Elena's heart rate remained steady at 60 beats per minute. Her breathing was controlled. Her mind was clear. She'd rehearsed this moment 100 times, and now it was happening exactly as predicted. Sir, I'm going to ask you to maintain appropriate distance and professional conduct. Her words were clipped and formal, designed to create legal documentation. This conversation has moved outside the bounds of appropriate interaction, and I believe we should. The slap came before she finished the sentence. Not his fist yet. That would come later. Just his open palm across her cheek, sharp and sudden, and designed to shock rather than seriously injure. The sound echoed off the mahogany walls like a gunshot. Elena felt the sting, tasted copper where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek, felt the heat blooming across her face, and smiled, because Victor Harrington had just made the biggest mistake of his 32-year career. The smile wasn't what Admiral Victor Harrington expected. It wasn't submission, wasn't fear, wasn't even defiance in the way he understood it. It was something else entirely, something that made the temperature in the room shift in a direction he couldn't quite identify. Lieutenant Commander Elena Thorne's expression held the kind of calm that comes from knowing something your opponent doesn't. The particular stillness of someone who'd been underestimated so consistently that they'd learned to use it as a tactical advantage. You know, Admiral, she said, her voice carrying a conversational tone that seemed wildly inappropriate for a woman who'd just been struck by a superior officer. I've been in situations where men thought they held all the cards before. She tilted her head slightly, studying his face with the clinical interest of someone examining a specimen. It's fascinating how authority can make people feel invincible right up until the moment they discover they're not. Harrington felt something flicker in his chest. Not quite alarm, but a recognition that this wasn't playing out according to the script he'd used successfully before. Other women had responded to that slap with tears, with stammered apologies, with the kind of broken submission that fed his need for dominance. But Thorne stood there like she was evaluating him, like she was making calculations he couldn't follow, like she knew something about the next 5 minutes that he didn't. And for the first time in 32 years of military service, Admiral Victor Harrington began to suspect that he might have made a serious mistake. "Don't you ever," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting, "presume to tell me what is and isn't appropriate in my own briefing room." He flexed his fingers, the threat implicit but unmistakable. "You're going to learn some respect, Lieutenant Commander. The easy way or the hard way, your choice." Elena's smile widened fractionally. "That's an interesting offer, Admiral. Very comprehensive. You've clearly thought this through." She paused, her eyes never leaving his face. "There's just one small problem with your plan." "What's that?" Harrington asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't genuinely interested in her objections. The question was rhetorical, the kind of indulgent inquiry a cat might make before finishing off a mouse. "You never asked about my background." Elena's voice took on an almost educational quality, like she was explaining a simple concept to someone who'd missed an obvious detail. "You saw Lieutenant Commander. You saw the surface credentials. You saw what looked like a standard intelligence officer with overseas experience. But you never dug deeper into what kind of overseas experience." Something cold moved through Harrington's stomach, a whisper of intuition that suggested he might have overlooked something important. But it was too late to reconsider now, too late to back down from a confrontation he'd initiated and escalated past the point of retreat. His reputation, his authority, his entire understanding of his place in the hierarchy depended on maintaining dominance in moments like this. "I don't care about your background," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than it had moments earlier. "Whatever you think you've done, wherever you think you've been, it doesn't matter in this room. In here, I'm the only authority that counts." Elena's expression shifted, and for the first time Harrington noticed something predatory in it, something that reminded him of expressions he'd seen on the faces of special operations personnel, the kind of people who dealt with problems that required solutions the regular military preferred not to discuss. "That's where you're wrong, Admiral," she said, her tone shifting from conversational to something harder, something that carried the weight of experience gained in places where mistakes weren't just career-ending, they were fatal. "You see, for the last 10 years, I haven't been stationed anywhere that appears on official deployment records. I haven't been writing intelligence reports from behind a desk in Norfolk or any other place where people wear dress blues and worry about fitness reports." Harrington felt his confidence beginning to crack, though he couldn't quite identify why. There was something in her posture now, something in the way she held her hands, something in her eyes that suggested she was no longer the cornered officer he thought he was intimidating. She looked like someone who'd been waiting for him to finish talking so she could get to work. "I've been in places where rank doesn't matter," Elena continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the entire room. "Where protocols don't exist. Where the only thing that keeps you alive is being better, faster, and more ruthless than everyone else trying to kill you. An admiral in those places, men who think they can take whatever they want, don't get administrative reprimands or career counseling. They get educated in ways they remember for the rest of their lives." The words hung in the air between them, like a challenge, fundamentally altering the dynamics Harrington thought he understood. He'd built his approach on assumptions about Thorne's background, her capabilities, her willingness to fight back against superior authority. But every word she spoke suggested those assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. "You're bluffing," he said, though uncertainty crept into his voice for the first time since their confrontation began. "You're trying to intimidate me with stories about some imaginary special operations background. But this isn't some foreign battlefield, sweetheart. This is an American naval facility, and I'm a 3-star admiral with 32 years of service." Elena tilted her head, studying him with the clinical interest of a predator evaluating prey. "You know what the difference is between you and the men I've dealt with overseas, Admiral. They were honest about what they were. They didn't hide behind uniforms and regulations and patriotic speeches. They were just killers who wanted to hurt people, and everyone knew exactly what they were dealing with." Her voice carried a quality Harrington had never heard before. Not anger, not fear, but something colder and infinitely more dangerous. Professional assessment delivered with surgical precision. But you, she continued, you've spent 32 years pretending to be something honorable while using your authority to prey on women who trusted the system to protect them. You've perverted everything this uniform is supposed to represent. And that Admiral Harrington makes you worse than any enemy I've ever faced. Harrington felt the first genuine flicker of alarm since the confrontation began. Something in Thorne's tone and her body language, in the way the very air in the room seemed to change around her, suggested he was no longer dealing with a subordinate officer who could be intimidated into compliance. He was dealing with something else entirely, something that had been carefully contained within the framework of military discipline and professional courtesy, but was now considering whether those constraints still applied. And for the first time in his career, Admiral Victor Harrington began to understand that his next decision might determine whether he walked out of this room under his own power. Do you know what happened to Colonel Victor Markov in Montenegro 3 years ago? Elena asked the question, seeming to come from nowhere, delivered with casual precision that suggested significance Harrington couldn't immediately grasp. He'd never heard of any Colonel Markov, had no knowledge of operations in Montenegro, couldn't understand why Thorne was introducing topics that had nothing to do with their current situation. I have no idea what you're talking about, he said, though something in her tone suggested this wasn't a random change of subject. Colonel Markov thought his rank made him untouchable too. Elena's voice carried the matter-of-fact quality of someone recounting historical events rather than making threats. He had a habit of using his authority to corner female subordinates in isolated locations. Thought his connections in the Serbian military would protect him from consequences. She took a step closer to Harrington, moving with fluid precision that suggested complete confidence in her physical capabilities. The difference was that Colonel Markov was honest about what he was doing. He didn't pretend it was about military discipline or professional correction. He just took what he wanted and relied on institutional power to cover his tracks. Harrington felt something cold spreading through his chest as Thorne continued her narrative, though he couldn't yet understand why this story felt like a personal threat rather than an abstract history lesson. The problem for Colonel Markov, Elena said, was that one of his targets wasn't actually a subordinate. She was someone like me operating under deep cover. Someone whose real background included capabilities he never bothered to investigate. Someone who'd been trained to handle predators who thought their authority made them immune to justice. The implications of Thorne's story began crystallizing in Harrington's mind, though he resisted accepting what seemed like an impossible scenario. The idea that a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy might possess the kind of background Thorne was implying challenged everything he understood about military personnel management and operational security. What happened to this colonel? Harrington asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to hear the answer. Elena's expression remained neutral, professional, as if she were briefing senior leadership on operational outcomes, rather than describing what sounded increasingly like a personal threat. Colonel Markov was found unconscious in his private office at the Podgorica military complex. Security cameras had been disabled. His personal guards had been neutralized non-lethally, and he'd suffered what medical personnel described as precisely applied trauma consistent with professional combat training. Harrington's throat felt dry as he processed the clinical details Thorne recounted with such casual expertise. The interesting part, she continued, was that Colonel Markov survived the encounter completely intact physically. No permanent damage, no serious injuries, nothing that would show up on medical examinations weeks later. But something about the experience changed his behavior permanently. He never again used his position to intimidate female personnel. In fact, he became quite vocal about the importance of protecting subordinates from predatory authority figures. The parallel between Thorne's story and their current situation was becoming impossible to ignore, though Harrington's mind recoiled from accepting that he might be facing someone capable of the actions she was describing. "You're talking about assault," he said, though his voice lacked the outrage such an accusation should have carried. "You're describing criminal conduct by military personnel." Elena nodded as if agreeing with his legal analysis. "That's one way to interpret the situation. Another way would be to recognize that Colonel Markov received education about the appropriate use of military authority delivered by someone qualified to provide that education through methods that ensured the lesson would be remembered permanently." She moved closer again, and Harrington noticed that her positioning now placed her between him and both the door and his communications equipment. Not obviously threatening, but strategically advantageous in ways that suggested tactical thinking rather than casual conversation. The really interesting part about Colonel Markov's education, Elena continued, was how it affected behavior throughout his entire command structure. Once word spread about what had happened, and in military communities were always spreads, other officers became much more careful about how they exercised their authority over subordinate personnel. Harrington felt trapped between competing impulses, the desperate need to reassert his dominance over a situation that was spiraling beyond his control, and growing recognition that Thorne represented a threat unlike anything he'd encountered in 3 decades of military service. "What exactly are you suggesting, Lieutenant Commander?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Elena's smile returned, though it carried no warmth whatsoever. "I'm not suggesting anything, Admiral. I'm simply sharing historical information about what happens when predatory authority figures encounter personnel with the training and authorization to provide corrective education." The phrase corrective education hung between them like a loaded weapon, its implications clear, despite the euphemistic language Thorne employed. "You see," she continued, "people like me exist specifically to handle problems that can't be resolved through normal administrative channels. When authority figures abuse their positions in ways that threaten operational security or unit cohesion, when the institutional protection mechanisms fail to address predatory behavior, when careers and lives are destroyed by people who think their rank exempts them from basic human decency, that's when specialists like me get activated." Harrington's understanding of their situation crystallized with terrifying clarity. He wasn't facing a subordinate officer who could be intimidated into silence. He was confronting someone whose actual mission parameters might include neutralizing threats like him, and he just provided her with legal justification for whatever came next. His hands trembled slightly as the full implications of Thorne's revelation settled into his consciousness like poison spreading through his bloodstream. The woman standing before him wasn't just another naval officer with overseas experience. She was something far more dangerous. Someone whose presence at Crimson Bay represented operational capabilities he'd never considered when planning his assault. "That's impossible," he whispered, though even as the words left his mouth, Harrington knew he was grasping at denial rather than stating facts. Naval intelligence officers don't receive that kind of training. There are protocols, oversight committees, congressional authorization requirements. Elena's expression shifted to something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so clinical. "Admiral, you're thinking about the military, the one with organizational charts and bureaucratic procedures and accountability measures. But there's another military one that operates in spaces between official acknowledgement and plausible deniability." She reached into her uniform pocket with movements so casual, Harrington didn't recognize them as tactical until she was holding something in her palm. A small device, matte black ceramic with indicators that suggested active recording capabilities. "Voice-activated recorder, military grade, admissible as evidence in courts-martial proceedings." Her tone carried the matter-of-fact quality of someone providing technical specifications. "Everything you've said and done in this room has been documented with time-stamp precision that will eliminate any ambiguity about sequence of events or criminal intent." Harrington stared at the device, his mind racing through implications he hadn't considered when he'd disabled the room's official surveillance systems. His careful preparation had eliminated institutional monitoring, but he'd never anticipated personal recording equipment that would capture conversations he'd assumed would remain private. The device represented evidence that could destroy his career regardless of Thorne's credibility or his ability to influence investigative procedures. Audio documentation of sexual assault, attempted rape, and abuse of authority. Crimes that carried sentences measured in decades rather than years, especially when committed by flag officers, whose oaths included specific pledges to protect those under their command. That's not possible," Harrington stammered, though the denial sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Personal recording devices aren't authorized in classified briefing facilities. Security protocols specifically prohibit. Personal recording devices aren't authorized for most personnel." Elena corrected, her voice carrying the patience of someone explaining technical details to a civilian. "But my operational clearance includes authorization for evidence collection in situations involving security violations, criminal conduct, or threats to operational integrity, which this situation definitely qualifies as, Admiral." The revelation changed everything Harrington thought he understood about their encounter. Thorne hadn't been trapped by his careful preparation. She'd been conducting an investigation that documented his crimes with precision that would make prosecution straightforward, regardless of his institutional connections or political influence. "You can't use that recording," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "It was obtained without my knowledge or consent. Any competent military lawyer would have it excluded from evidence on procedural grounds." Elena's smile widened, and Harrington noticed that her expression held the particular satisfaction of someone who'd anticipated every possible objection. "Actually, Admiral, my authorization includes exemption from standard consent requirements when documenting criminal activity by senior military personnel. The recording is not only admissible, it's legally protected evidence that can't be suppressed regardless of procedural challenges." Harrington's legs felt weak as he realized that Thorne had outmaneuvered him completely, turning his own carefully planned assault into documented evidence of federal crimes. But recognition of his legal vulnerability only intensified his desperation, rather than encouraging retreat from the confrontation he'd initiated. "Nobody will believe that recording represents the full context," he said, though his voice carried little conviction. "A few minutes of audio can be edited, manipulated, taken out of context. It's my 32 years of unblemished service against the word of a junior officer with questionable judgment." "Questionable judgment," Elena interrupted, and for the first time Harrington heard genuine emotion in her voice, not fear or submission, but something colder and infinitely more dangerous. "Admiral, questionable judgment is what you demonstrated when you decided to assault someone without bothering to investigate who you were really dealing with." She took another step closer, and Harrington noticed that her movements carried the fluid precision of someone trained in close-quarters combat. "You see, my personnel file contains information you never bothered to access. Classifications that require special authorization to review. Operational histories that exist in databases you don't have clearance to examine." Harrington felt panic rising in his throat as Thorne continued speaking with the calm authority of someone who held all the tactical advantages. "For the last decade, I've been assigned to Joint Special Operations Command, working under non-official cover in regions where American personnel officially don't operate. My actual military occupational specialty involves what the Pentagon euphemistically calls kinetic problem resolution, eliminating threats to national security through direct action when diplomatic or legal remedies prove insufficient." The clinical terminology couldn't disguise what Thorne was describing, and Harrington felt his remaining composure cracking as he processed the implications of her revelation. He wasn't confronting a standard intelligence officer who could be intimidated through institutional pressure. He was facing someone whose actual job involved neutralizing threats like him. "You're telling me you're an assassin," he said, though the word felt inadequate for describing the professional capabilities Thorne was claiming. "I'm telling you I'm someone who specializes in handling predators who use institutional authority to harm others," Elena replied. "Someone who's been trained to recognize, document, and neutralize threats to operational security and unit cohesion. Someone who's encountered men exactly like you in places where they couldn't hide behind rank or political connections." Harrington's hand moved instinctively toward the communications device on his desk, some desperate part of his mind still believing that summoning security forces might salvage a situation that had moved far beyond institutional solutions. Elena noticed the movement immediately. "Admiral, I wouldn't recommend trying to call for help. Your security detail is trained to protect you from external threats, but they're not equipped to handle someone with my background operating under legal authority to document and respond to criminal conduct." Harrington's hand froze mid-reach as he realized that Thorne was right. His bodyguards were positioned to prevent attacks from outside the facility, not to manage confrontations with personnel who possess legitimate authorization to be in restricted areas. And Thorne had just made it clear that whatever happened next would be legally justified as self-defense against criminal assault. But Harrington's desperation peaked as he recognized that all his carefully constructed advantages had been turned against him. Instead of accepting defeat, panic drove him toward the final mistake that would transform their confrontation from criminal assault into something far more decisive. "You think you're so clever," he snarled, his voice losing all pretense of military professionalism. Walking in here with your recording devices and your special operations stories, thinking you can intimidate me with tales about foreign colonels and covert operations. But you've made one critical mistake, Lieutenant Commander. Elena remained motionless, though Harrington noticed her breathing had shifted to the deep, controlled pattern of someone preparing for physical exertion. Her hands stayed folded, but there was something different about her posture now, a readiness that hadn't been visible during their verbal sparring. The mistake, Harrington continued, moving closer despite every instinct that should have warned him to maintain distance, is thinking that your little recording will matter once you're dead. Audio evidence becomes irrelevant when the only witness suffers a tragic accident during what was obviously a consensual encounter that went wrong. The threat was explicit, now eliminating any remaining ambiguity about Harrington's intentions. He'd moved beyond sexual assault into territory that included potential murder, apparently believing that eliminating Thorne would resolve the legal complications her evidence created. Elena's expression didn't change, but Harrington caught a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear, but what might have been professional disappointment at his predictable escalation to lethal threats. "Admiral," she said quietly, "you should know that my authorization includes real-time data transmission. Everything that's happened in this room has already been uploaded to secure servers monitored by personnel who specialize in protecting assets like me. Your threat to kill me just upgraded this situation from criminal assault to potential homicide, which activates response protocols you really don't want to trigger." Harrington felt a moment of genuine terror as Thorne's words registered, but panic had driven him beyond rational calculation. The idea that their confrontation was being monitored by external agencies, that his threats were being documented in real time by people with authority to intervene, should have convinced him to surrender immediately. Instead, desperation convinced him that his only remaining option was to eliminate the threat Thorne represented before her mysterious support network would respond to his escalating criminal behavior. "You're bluffing," he said, though his voice cracked with uncertainty. "If you really had that kind of backup, if people were really monitoring this conversation, they would have intervened already. You're alone in here with me, just like I planned." Elena tilted her head slightly, studying Harrington with the clinical interest of someone observing a specimen that had behaved exactly as predicted. "Admiral, the reason nobody has intervened yet is because my handlers are waiting to see how far you'll take this. Your behavior is providing valuable intelligence about how predators like you operate within military command structures." Harrington's face contorted with rage as he processed the implication that their entire encounter had been orchestrated not by him, but by Thorne and whatever organization had deployed her to Crimson Bay. The careful isolation he'd arranged, the disabled surveillance, the locked doors, none of it had trapped Thorne. It had trapped him in a controlled environment where his criminal tendencies could be documented with precision that would support systemic reforms to prevent future predators from operating with impunity. "You set me up," he whispered, the full magnitude of his miscalculation finally becoming clear. "This whole thing was planned. You knew exactly what I was going to do." Elena nodded as if acknowledging an obvious observation. "Admiral, men like you are remarkably predictable. Your behavioral patterns have been studied, analyzed, and documented by people whose job it is to understand how institutional predators operate. Everything you've done tonight follows a script we've seen hundreds of times before." Harrington felt the last vestiges of his authority crumbling as Thorne revealed the systematic nature of whatever operation had targeted him. He wasn't facing a random encounter with an unusually capable subordinate. He was confronting a deliberately planned investigation that had used his own predatory instincts against him. "The difference," Elena continued, "is that this time the target had resources you didn't anticipate training. You couldn't overcome authority that superseded your institutional protection, and evidence that will ensure you face consequences that other predators have avoided through political connections and administrative cover-ups." Outside conference room, Delta 7 Master Chief Tobias Garrett stood at his post with growing unease. 24 years of protecting flag officers had given him instincts about when situations were developing in directions that required intervention. And everything about this particular meeting felt wrong. The timeline was off. Standard briefings didn't exceed 30 minutes unless they involved complex operational planning. Thorne had been inside for 23 minutes, and Garrett had heard nothing but muffled voices that suggested intense conversation rather than routine consultation. The Admiral had dismissed Lieutenant Commander Whitmore immediately after Thorne entered. That was pattern. Garrett had facilitated dozens of these private meetings over 8 years, and they always followed the same sequence. Female officer summoned, aide dismissed, door locked, extended private discussion. Garrett had never asked what happened during those meetings, hadn't wanted to know. Professional bodyguards maintained operational focus on external threats, not internal dynamics between officers of different ranks. But standing outside Delta 7 listening to voices rise and fall through soundproofing, designed to prevent exactly that kind of monitoring, Garrett felt the weight of 8 years of willful ignorance pressing down on him like physical force. He'd seen the pattern. Female officers arriving with professional confidence and departing with something broken in their eyes. Transfer requests that followed private meetings. Complaints that somehow never reached official channels. The careful way women navigated hallways when Admiral Harrington was present. Garrett had seen it all and chosen to see nothing. Because his job was protecting the Admiral from external threats. Because questioning a flag officer's conduct would end his career. Because the system rewarded loyalty and punished moral courage. But the voice he heard now through the reinforced door carried a tone that didn't match the pattern. Where previous victims had sounded frightened or pleading or defeated, Lieutenant Commander Thorne sounded calm, professional, almost conversational. And then he heard Admiral Harrington's voice raised in anger. "You're alone in here with me, just like I planned." Garrett's hand moved to his sidearm without conscious decision. Petty Officer Marshall noticed the gesture, his own posture shifting from parade rest to combat readiness. Chief Marshall's voice was quiet but urgent. "Something's wrong," Garrett said, though he was still processing exactly what wrong meant in this context. The Admiral was his protectee. His loyalty belonged to Harrington by every regulation and tradition that governed executive protection details. But loyalty to what? To a man, or to the principles the uniform represented? Garrett was still wrestling with that question when he heard the unmistakable sound of flesh. Striking flesh, followed by Admiral Harrington's voice raised to a shout that the soundproofing couldn't contain. "Evidence becomes irrelevant when the only witness has an accident." The words crystallized everything Garrett had refused to acknowledge for 8 years. Not a private briefing, not professional counseling. Murder threat against a subordinate officer in a secured facility. His hand was already moving toward the door override when he heard the second impact, heavier, more definite. The sound of something substantial hitting the marble floor. Garrett breached the door with Marshall providing cover weapons drawn, but not yet aimed professional training, taking over even as his mind struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. Admiral Victor Harrington lay unconscious on the polished marble floor, positioned in recovery position with clinical precision that suggested medical training rather than violent assault. And standing calmly beside him, hands visible and posture relaxed, Lieutenant Commander Elena Thorne waited with the infinite patience of someone who'd expected exactly this response and had already calculated her next 3 moves. "Master Chief Garrett," she said, her voice carrying the same professional courtesy she might use during a routine briefing. "Admiral Harrington is unconscious but stable. He'll regain consciousness within the next few minutes with no permanent injury." Garrett's weapon remained drawn but not aimed, his training and instincts warring with each other as he tried to assess a situation that violated every protocol he'd spent 2 decades mastering. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "did you assault Admiral Harrington?" Elena's expression didn't change. "I defended myself against Admiral Harrington's physical assault after he committed sexual battery and threatened my life. Everything that occurred in this room has been recorded and will be submitted as evidence in the criminal proceedings that will follow this incident." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, changing everything Garrett thought he understood about his duty, his loyalty, and his role in the institutional machinery that had protected a predator for 8 years. Master Chief Tobias Garrett had made hundreds of tactical decisions over 24 years of protecting flag officers in environments ranging from secure Pentagon briefings to forward operating bases where threats measured in milliseconds. He'd learned to process complex situations with the speed that kept protectees alive and missions successful. But standing in the doorway of conference room Delta 7, weapon drawn, looking at an unconscious 3-star admiral and a calm lieutenant commander who just claimed self-defense, Garrett faced a decision that transcended tactical considerations into territory where regulations offered no clear guidance. His training said, protect the principal. His oath said, uphold justice. And the sick feeling in his stomach said he'd spent 8 years enabling something that should have been stopped long ago. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remain in position while we secure Admiral Harrington and request medical assistance, Garrett said, though uncertainty crept into his voice as he attempted to apply standard procedures to a situation that clearly wasn't standard. Petty Officer Marshall moved into the room maintaining cover position while his eyes swept for additional threats. Finding none, his gaze settled on Harrington's unconscious form with an expression that suggested he was processing implications he'd never considered before. Elena nodded agreement, maintaining her position with hands visible. Master Chief, this device contains complete audio documentation of Admiral Harrington's sexual assault and subsequent threat to kill me. I'm prepared to provide this evidence to NCIS investigators when they arrive, along with a detailed statement about the criminal conduct that occurred in this room. Garrett felt the situation shifting beneath him like deck plates in heavy seas. The words Elena spoke, sexual assault threat to kill criminal conduct, transformed this from a simple physical altercation between officers into something that would require investigation far beyond his authority to manage. Marshall, he said, making the decision that would define the remainder of his career, contact base securities and request immediate response from Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Also request medical evaluation team and legal counsel for all parties involved. This is now a potential criminal matter requiring proper documentation and chain of custody procedures. Marshall's eyes widened slightly, but he moved to execute the order without hesitation. The communications protocol would create an official record that couldn't be buried through administrative discretion. Once NCIS was formally requested, the investigation would proceed according to federal law enforcement procedures rather than internal Navy discipline. Garrett had just made it impossible for Admiral Harrington's protection network to contain whatever had happened in this room. Elena retrieved the recording device from her uniform pocket, holding it visible to both security personnel. The gesture was deliberate, establishing the device's existence for witnesses who could testify about unbroken chain of custody. Master Chief, this device contains complete audio documentation of Admiral Harrington's sexual assault and my defensive response. I'm prepared to provide this evidence to NCIS investigators when they arrive, along with detailed statement about the criminal conduct that occurred in this room. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, changing the atmosphere in ways that couldn't be reversed. Garrett and Marshall exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their shared recognition that their careers had just intersected with something far more serious than routine security duty. Admiral Harrington began stirring on the floor, consciousness returning as his brain recovered from temporary oxygen deprivation. His first attempts at movement were uncoordinated hands reaching automatically toward his head as neurological systems came back online. But his breathing remained steady and his color continued to improve, indicating no serious trauma beyond the controlled unconsciousness Elena had induced. Garrett knelt beside Harrington, conducting professional medical assessment while simultaneously processing the broader implications of this incident. Pulse steady, breathing regular, pupils responsive but dilated, skin color normal, all indicators of someone recovering from controlled unconsciousness rather than serious head trauma. He'd seen similar presentations in personnel who'd been subdued through non-lethal force by military police or security contractors. But he'd never encountered a situation where a flag officer was the recipient of such techniques, or where the force had been applied by a female lieutenant commander who stood calmly explaining that she'd defended herself against sexual assault and murder threat. Harrington's eyes opened, blinking in confusion as awareness returned and memory began reconstructing the events that had led to his current position on the briefing room floor. His gaze found Elena first, then shifted to Garrett and Marshall, then back to Elena, with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand that his carefully constructed authority had collapsed along with his consciousness. "What?" Harrington began, his voice thick and uncertain, as he struggled to organize thoughts that felt fragmented and incomplete. The last clear memory he could access was throwing a punch that should have connected with Elena's face, though obviously something had gone catastrophically wrong between intention and execution. "Admiral Harrington," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the same professional courtesy she'd maintained throughout their encounter. You're under arrest for sexual assault, attempted rape, abuse of authority, and threatening the life of a subordinate officer. Master Chief Garrett has requested NCIS response, and you'll be taken into federal custody pending formal charges. The words seemed to reach Harrington through layers of confusion and returning awareness. He tried to sit up, but Garrett's hand on his shoulder prevented the movement with professional firmness. Sir, please remain still until medical personnel can evaluate you. Garrett said, his tone neutral, but carrying authority that suggested compliance wasn't optional. Harrington's eyes moved to Garrett with something that might have been betrayal or disbelief. Chief, what are you doing? I'm your commanding officer. I order you to place this woman under arrest for assaulting a flag officer. Garrett met his protectee's eyes without flinching. Sir, I heard your threat through the door. You told Lieutenant Commander Thorne that evidence would be irrelevant when the only witness had an accident. That's not a briefing, Admiral. That's a murder threat, and I can't protect you from the consequences of your own criminal conduct. The statement was delivered with professional courtesy, but its implications were devastating. Garrett had just testified against the man he'd been assigned to protect, choosing justice over loyalty in a way that would reverberate through both their careers. Harrington's face drained of remaining color as the full magnitude of his situation became clear. Not just assault charges, but murder threat witnessed by his own bodyguard. Not just one victim's testimony, but audio documentation and corroborating witnesses. Not just institutional discipline, but federal criminal prosecution that would attract media attention and congressional oversight. Everything he'd built for 32 years was disintegrating in real time, and there was nothing his rank or connections could do to stop it. The arrival of NCIS Special Agent Marcus Kincaid 40 minutes later transformed Conference Room Delta 7 from crime scene into federal investigation. Kincaid was 48 years old with the weathered competence of someone who'd spent 2 decades investigating crimes that ranged from routine theft to espionage and murder. He'd seen a lot in his career. But walking into Crimson Bay's most secure briefing facility to find a 3-star admiral in custody for sexual assault and attempted murder represented something unprecedented even by federal law enforcement standards. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, Kincaid said, his tone professional, but not unfriendly. We've been monitoring your transmission in real time. Audio quality was excellent. Timestamp documentation is comprehensive. You've just provided us with the cleanest documented case of command sexual assault I've seen in 23 years with NCIS. He turned to Garrett with an expression that might have been approval or sympathy. Master Chief, your testimony about the murder threat will be critical. You made the right call, requesting federal investigation. Garrett nodded slowly, feeling the weight of that decision settling into his bones. Sir, I should have made it 8 years ago. The statement carried implications that Kincaid recognized immediately. How many other incidents did you observe during your assignment to Admiral Harrington's security detail? I didn't observe incidents, sir. I observed patterns. Garrett's voice was steady, but his eyes reflected something that might have been guilt or regret. Female officers arriving for private meetings. Those same officers requesting transfers shortly afterward. Complaints that disappeared before reaching official channels. I saw it, and I chose not to see it because my job was protecting the Admiral from external threats, not questioning his conduct with subordinates. That's going to change, Kincaid said, and there was steel beneath his professional courtesy. This investigation is going to examine Admiral Harrington's entire command history, every private meeting, every transfer request, every disappeared complaint. We're going to find every victim, document every assault, and dismantle whatever protection network allowed this to continue for years. He gestured to the recording device still visible in Elena's hand. But we start with this. Lieutenant Commander, I'm going to need you to provide detailed testimony about everything that occurred in this room. The process will take several hours and it won't be pleasant to relive. But your documentation is going to ensure that Admiral Harrington faces consequences that other predators have avoided through institutional protection. Elena handed over the device with careful precision, maintaining chain of custody that would survive the most aggressive legal challenge. Agent Kincaid, you should know this wasn't an isolated incident. Commander Patricia Ashford, Lieutenant Kate Sullivan, and at least 4 other women were assaulted by Admiral Harrington using identical patterns over the past 4 years. Their testimonies are documented in the files you've been compiling. Kincaid nodded. And now that we have hard evidence of Harrington's methods and mentality, those testimonies become corroborating witnesses rather than uncorroborated accusations. This case just became prosecutable, Commander. You've done something important here. The investigation moved with unprecedented speed over the following 72 hours, driven by evidence so overwhelming that even Harrington's military counsel recommended immediate plea negotiations rather than trial proceedings that would result in public exposure of details damaging to institutional reputation and personal legacy. But Elena had spent 8 hours in that first session, providing detailed testimony to investigators who recorded every word with digital precision while building case files that would determine whether Harrington faced court-martial or civilian prosecution. The recording device provided unambiguous evidence of sexual assault, attempted rape, abuse of authority, and explicit murder threat. Combined with Garrett's eyewitness testimony about the threat, Sullivan's and Ashford's corroborating statements about identical patterns and medical documentation of Elena's injuries. Consistent with her account, the prosecution possessed evidence that eliminated any possibility of successful defense. Commander Patricia Ashford was among the first to contact NCIS investigators after news of Harrington's arrest spread through unofficial channels. She'd spent 6 months in self-imposed exile at a listening post in the Aleutian Islands, choosing isolation over fighting back against a system she believed would protect the powerful and silence the vulnerable. But standing in Kincaid's temporary office at Crimson Bay, providing detailed testimony about Harrington's assault 6 months earlier, Ashford felt something she hadn't experienced since that day in his office, hope that justice might actually be possible. He used the same room, she told Kincaid, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of revisiting trauma. Delta 7, same isolation tactics, dismissed his aide, locked the door, disabled surveillance. Then he moved from behind his desk and put his hand on my shoulder, fingers pressing down like he owned me. She described Harrington's escalation with clinical precision, providing dates, times, his exact words. The progression from professional conversation to personal intimidation to explicit threat about career consequences if she reported what was obviously moving toward physical assault. I requested transfer before he could complete what he was planning, Ashford said. I told myself I was being strategic, preserving my career, avoiding confrontation that would destroy everything I'd built over 20 years. But the truth is, I was terrified. Terrified of him, terrified of the system that would take his word over mine, terrified of becoming another woman whose career ended because she dared to say no to a flag officer. Kincaid listened with professional attention while building supplementary cases that would ensure Harrington faced consequences for crimes extending beyond his assault on Elena. Commander, your testimony establishes pattern of behavior that's critical for prosecution. Would you be willing to testify at court-martial if this proceeds to trial? Ashford met his eyes without hesitation. Yes, sir. Lieutenant Commander Thorne fought back when I couldn't. The least I can do is stand beside her now. Lieutenant Kate Sullivan provided similar testimony about incidents that occurred during joint training exercises 3 months earlier. Her detailed recollections of dates, times, locations, and witnesses provided corroborating evidence that established Harrington's methodical approach to creating opportunities for assault while maintaining plausible deniability. He arranged a private briefing during the exercise. Sullivan explained, her voice carrying the particular anger of someone whose promising career had been derailed by institutional failure. Said he needed my input on communications protocols. But his questions had nothing to do with communications. He wanted to know about my personal life, my relationships, whether I had family who would miss me if I were stationed overseas for extended periods. She described how Harrington's demeanor shifted once he'd established the briefing room isolation, how his questions became more invasive, how he'd moved close enough that she could smell coffee on his breath and see something predatory in his eyes. When I tried to leave, he blocked the door, told me that junior officers needed to understand how things really worked at senior levels. That career advancement required more than technical competence. It required knowing how to make the right people happy. Sullivan's hands had curled into fists as she recounted the memory. I filed a complaint the next day through official channels. 2 weeks later, I was transferred to a logistics position in Norfolk. My fast track to command was over, and everyone knew why, even if nobody would say it. But the most devastating testimony came from someone who'd been silent for 40 years. Captain Sarah Brennan retired was 68 years old and walked with the careful precision of someone whose body had accumulated decades of damage that had nothing to do with combat. She'd served during an era when women in the military were tolerated rather than welcomed, when reporting assault meant ending your own career rather than your attackers. Standing before the court, Brennan's voice was steady as she described events from 1984. I was a lieutenant assigned to Admiral Thomas Caldwell's staff at Norfolk. He was Admiral Harrington's mentor, and he taught him everything, including how to prey on female subordinates and use the chain of command to bury complaints. She described Caldwell's assault with clinical precision: the isolated office, the disabled surveillance, the explicit threats about career consequences. Patterns identical to what Harrington would employ decades later. I filed a complaint through official channels. It disappeared. 2 weeks later, I was informed I could either accept transfer to a supply depot in Alaska or face court-martial for making false accusations against a superior officer. Brennan's eyes moved to Harrington. I chose Alaska. I chose silence. And I watched as Thomas Caldwell continued his career, eventually retiring with full honors, while women like me disappeared from service. When I heard he'd taken a young officer named Victor Harrington under his wing, I knew exactly what he was teaching him. But I stayed silent because the system had taught me that speaking meant destruction. Her testimony established something crucial. This wasn't aberrant behavior. It was institutional patterns spanning generations, protected by networks that valued reputation over justice. Kincaid asked the question everyone was thinking. Captain Brennan, why come forward now after 40 years? Brennan's answer was simple. Because Lieutenant Commander Thorne proved that silence isn't the only option anymore. That the system can change. That predators can be stopped. I couldn't fight back in 1980, but I can stand beside the women who are fighting now. The pattern was identical across all 6 victims who came forward in those first 72 hours. Private meetings in isolated locations, disabled surveillance, psychological intimidation before physical assault, explicit threats about career consequences, and institutional mechanisms that protected the predator while punishing victims who dared to speak. But the investigation revealed something even more disturbing than Harrington's individual crimes. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Whitmore, Harrington's aide for the past 3 years, had systematically destroyed documentation of complaints, manipulated transfer requests to appear voluntary, and received promotion in choice assignments, each time he successfully buried evidence of his superior's misconduct. Under interrogation, Whitmore initially maintained that he'd simply followed orders and facilitated administrative processes he didn't have authority to question. But faced with evidence of his active participation in conspiracy to obstruct justice, his resistance crumbled. Admiral Harrington had connections at Pentagon level. Whitmore said, his voice hollow with the recognition of how thoroughly he'd compromised his own integrity. He told me that female officers who filed complaints were trying to destroy the careers of men who'd served honorably for decades. That my job was protecting the institution from false accusations that would undermine military readiness and unit cohesion. Kincaid leaned forward, his expression hardening. You believe that 6 different women with no connection to each other independently decided to fabricate identical accusations against the same flag officer. Whitmore's silence was answer enough. The investigation expanded rapidly as Kincaid's team discovered that Harrington's protection network had extended beyond a single corrupted aide. Captain James Brennan, serving in Navy JAG, had blocked legal proceedings against Harrington twice over 4 years. Rear Admiral Douglas Keene had provided false character references that undermined accusers' credibility. Commander Barbara Shaw and personnel had manipulated transfer requests and fitness reports to make victims appear unstable or unsuitable for continued service. The conspiracy wasn't just about one predator. It was about an institutional system that had learned to protect its own at the expense of those it was supposed to defend. 3 weeks after Elena's confrontation with Harrington, the case went to General Court-Martial at Naval Station Norfolk. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, military observers, and advocates who recognized this trial as a watershed moment for how the armed forces addressed sexual assault by senior officers. Captain Jennifer Stratford, leading the prosecution, was a 20-year veteran of military justice, with a reputation for methodical case development and devastating courtroom presence. She'd volunteer for this assignment, knowing it would make her targets for retaliation from officers who valued institutional protection over accountability. Her opening statement was surgical in its precision. Members of the jury, over the next several days, you will hear audio recording of a three-star admiral sexually assaulting a subordinate officer, threatening her life, and then attacking her physically when she refused to submit. You will hear testimony for 6 additional victims describing identical patterns of predatory behavior spanning 4 years. And you will hear evidence of systematic conspiracy to obstruct justice involving multiple officers who chose institutional protection over their oaths to defend those under their command. She played the recording in full, 73 minutes of audio documentation that captured every word of Harrington's escalation from professional conversation to sexual assault to explicit murder threat. The courtroom listened in absolute silence as Harrington's own voice condemned him with clarity that eliminated any possibility of misinterpretation or context manipulation. When Elena's voice came through the speakers, calm professional, giving Harrington multiple opportunities to retreat, several jury members leaned forward. When the sound of flesh striking flesh marked Harrington's slap, a collective intake of breath rippled through the courtroom. And when Harrington's threat echoed from the speakers, evidence becomes irrelevant when the only witness has an accident. The atmosphere in the room shifted in ways that transcended legal proceedings into moral reckoning. Commander Lawrence Castellano, leading Harrington's defense, attempted to argue entrapment, that Elena had deliberately provoked the assault through calculated disrespect designed to trigger violent response. That her JSOC background and combat training meant she'd never been in genuine danger and had manipulated the situation to create criminal charges against a decorated officer. But Judge Captain Robert Morrison, presiding with 30 years of judicial experience, shut down that argument with prejudice. Counsel, are you seriously arguing that a subordinate officer challenging a superior's tactical judgment constitutes legal provocation for sexual assault and murder threat? That professional disagreement somehow justifies criminal violence? Because if that's your defense, you should know it exalts the intelligence of this court and every officer who's ever served with integrity. The trial lasted 6 days. Elena testified for 11 hours, describing not just the assault itself, but the careful preparation that had made documentation possible. Her testimony was clinical and devastating, delivered with the same professional precision she demonstrated during the confrontation. Castellano's cross-examination attempted to paint her as provocateur, but Elena's responses demolished every attack. When asked why she deliberately submitted a disrespectful report, she replied that professional disagreement based on operational experience wasn't disrespect. It was the duty of competent officers to provide honest assessment, even when it challenged senior leadership. When asked why she'd smiled after being struck, Elena's response was simple and damning. Because I knew at that moment Admiral Harrington had provided documented proof of assault that would ensure he faced consequences for crimes he'd committed against at least 6 women over 4 years. Yes, I smiled. Justice was finally possible. Ashford and Sullivan testified about their own assaults, their voices steady as they described experiences that had haunted them for months. 4 additional victims provided similar accounts, creating a pattern so consistent it eliminated any possibility that Harrington's assault on Elena had been aberrant behavior. Master Chief Garrett's testimony was particularly powerful because it came from someone whose professional duty had been protecting Harrington. His description of hearing the murder threat through the door of making the decision to request NCIS rather than cover for his principal carried weight that defense counsel couldn't undermine. I spent 8 years facilitating Admiral Harrington's private meetings with female officers. Garrett said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated guilt. I told myself I was just doing my job, that whatever happened inside those meetings wasn't my responsibility. But I was wrong, and my failure to act allowed a predator to operate with impunity. I'm testifying now because Lieutenant Commander Thorne had the courage I lacked. The verdict came after 4 hours of jury deliberation. Guilty on all counts: sexual assault, attempted rape, abuse of authority, conduct, unbecoming an officer, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and making criminal threats. The convictions carried mandatory minimum sentences that guaranteed Harrington would spend the remainder of his productive years in federal prison. Sentencing occurred 1 week later. Judge Morrison's statement was brief but devastating. Admiral Harrington, you were entrusted with authority to protect those under your command. Instead, you used that authority and a weapon to prey upon women who trusted the system to defend them. You perverted everything the uniform represents. You betrayed your oath, your service, and every officer who's ever served with honor. This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, to be followed by dishonorable discharge and forfeiture of all military benefits and retirement pay. Harrington's reaction was shock denial, then something that might have been recognition that his entire identity had been obliterated by his own documented words. Everything he'd built for 32 years, the career, the reputation, the authority, turned to ash in a courtroom where justice finally caught up with institutional protection. But the trial's conclusion was just the beginning of broader transformation. The Pentagon, facing congressional pressure and media scrutiny, announced comprehensive reforms within days of the verdict. An independent investigation board was established to examine sexual assault allegations against senior officers operating outside normal chain of command. Anonymous reporting systems were implemented to protect victims from retaliation. Mandatory training programs were expanded to educate personnel about recognizing and preventing harassment before it escalated to assault. Most significantly, promotion boards were restructured to include specific evaluation of how officers treated subordinates, with input from enlisted personnel and junior officers who'd served under their command. The message was clear: technical competence and tactical excellence weren't sufficient for advancement. Leadership required demonstrated commitment to protecting those under your authority. The protection network that had enabled Harrington began to collapse as investigators expanded their inquiry. Captain Brennan was suspended from JAG and faced charges for obstruction of justice. Rear Admiral Keene was forced into retirement with pension reduction. Commander Shaw received court-martial for conspiracy and accessory to sexual assault. Lieutenant Commander Whitmore accepted plea agreement that included testimony against his co-conspirators in exchange for reduced sentence. The institutional changes weren't just procedural. They represented cultural shift in how the military understood accountability. For decades, the Brotherhood had protected its own, even when protection meant enabling predators. But Elena's documentation of Harrington's crimes, combined with testimony from victims who'd finally found institutional support, demonstrated that protecting the institution meant holding criminals accountable regardless of their rank or service record. Master Chief Garrett's voluntary demotion and transfer to training command became part of that transformation. He spent his remaining years before retirement teaching bodyguards and security personnel to recognize warning signs of predatory behavior, to prioritize protection of potential victims over blind loyalty to protectees, to understand that true professionalism sometimes meant standing against those you were assigned to serve. His testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee about his failure to act became required viewing for personnel assigned to executive protection details. I saw the pattern for 8 years and chose to see nothing. I told myself that questioning a flag officer would end my career, so I stayed silent while women suffered. That silence made me complicit in Admiral Harrington's crimes. Real protection means defending everyone under your care, not just the people with stars on their collars. 6 months after Harrington's conviction, Elena transferred to JSOC headquarters with new responsibilities that reflected both her operational capabilities and her demonstrated commitment to institutional reform. Her official assignment involved training next-generation operators in techniques she'd refined over 12 years of classified operations. But her unofficial mission was creating mentorship programs that connected assault survivors with resources, support, and advocacy. She taught female officers not just combat skills, but how to navigate institutional barriers, document evidence, and pursue justice through proper channels when those channels finally became accessible. Colonel James Blackwood, now 73 and officially retired but still maintaining connections throughout Special Operations community, visited Elena at the training facility on a cold morning that reminded them both of that day at the shooting range 72 hours before everything changed. He watched her conducting hand-to-hand combat instruction for a class of female SEAL candidates, noting the precision of her technique and the confidence she instilled in students who'd spent their entire careers being told they weren't strong enough, fast enough, or tough enough for this level of service. "You remember what I told you that morning at the range?" Blackwood asked when the training session concluded. Elena smiled. "You told me a lot of things that morning, sir. Which particular wisdom are you referencing?" That righteous anger is a weapon but also a liability, that it makes you predictable and drives you to take risks you shouldn't take. His ice blue eyes studied her face with the same assessment that had evaluated hundreds of operators over 45 years. I was wrong about the liability part. Your anger was justified and the risks you took were calculated. You changed something important, Elena, not just for those 6 women, but for everyone who comes after. 7 women, Elena corrected quietly. Don't forget Commander Phillips from 2 years before Ashford. She committed suicide 6 months after requesting transfer from Harrington's command. We found her name during the expanded investigation. She filed a complaint that disappeared and nobody bothered to ask why a decorated officer with exemplary service record would take her own life. Blackwood's expression darkened. 7 women that we know about. God knows how many others over 32 years who just disappeared from service or suffered in silence because they thought the system would never protect them. The system is changing, Elena said, though her tone suggested she understood how incremental that change would be. Not fast enough, not comprehensively enough. But it's changing because we prove that predators can be stopped when victims have evidence and courage to pursue accountability. You proved that, Blackwood corrected. You walked into that room knowing what would happen, knowing the risks, knowing that failure meant your career was over, and Harrington walked free. That took courage. I'm not sure I could have managed at your age. You trained me for it, sir. Every lesson about tactical preparation, every drill about controlling fear, every conversation about knowing when to fight and when to retreat, all of it prepared me for that moment when Harrington threw his punch and I had 3 seconds to end his career or let him destroy mine. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 warriors separated by generations but united by understanding that some battles require different weapons than those taught in official training. What happens now? Blackwood asked finally. Now I teach others what you taught me. How to recognize threats that wear friendly faces. How to document evidence that survives legal challenge. How to fight back when fighting seems impossible. Elena's voice carried quiet determination. And I make sure that every woman who enters this facility understands that competence is armor evidence, is weapon, and justice is possible when you're willing to risk everything to achieve it. Lieutenant Sarah Brightwell was 26 years old, fresh from advanced SEAL training, and still processing what it meant to be among the first women accepted into communities that had been exclusively male for decades. She approached Elena after class with the particular hesitation of someone who wanted to ask a question but wasn't sure she had the right to intrude. Ma'am, I heard about what you did with Admiral Harrington. Brightwell's voice was quiet but steady. I heard that you let him hit you so you could document what he'd done to other women who couldn't fight back. Elena studied the young officer, recognizing something of her younger self in those determined eyes. That's one way to interpret what happened. Another way would be to say, I created conditions where a predator revealed his true nature and faced consequences he should have faced years earlier. Either way, Brightwell continued, you showed me something I needed to see, that it's possible to win, that the system can work if you have evidence and courage. 6 weeks ago, a senior instructor made inappropriate comments about my physical fitness standards. Not assault, not even close to what Harrington did, but inappropriate enough that it made me uncomfortable. And instead of staying silent like I might have before hearing your story, I documented it and filed a report through the new anonymous system. What happened? Elena asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. The instructor was removed from training duty pending investigation. 2 other women came forward with similar complaints about his behavior. He's facing administrative discipline and mandatory retraining on professional conduct. It's not a court-martial, but it's accountability. He learned that behavior has consequences before it could escalate to something worse. Elena felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the day she'd walked into conference room Delta 7. That's exactly what's supposed to happen. You recognized a problem, you documented it, you reported it through proper channels, and the system responded appropriately. That's the change we fought for. You fought for it, ma'am. I just benefited from it. Brightwell's voice carried gratitude, mixed with something that might have been awe. But I want you to know that every woman in this training pipeline knows your story. We know what you risked and what you accomplished. And we're not going to let it be for nothing. After Brightwell left, Elena returned to her quarters and pulled out a letter she'd received 2 weeks earlier. The return address showed a federal prison in Pennsylvania where Victor Harrington was serving his 25-year sentence in isolation from general population former flag officers, were targets for inmates looking to enhance their own status through violence against symbols of authority. The letter was brief, written in handwriting that suggested someone struggling to maintain composure. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, I don't expect forgiveness and I don't deserve understanding. But I want you to know that I've spent every day of my incarceration thinking about the women I hurt over 32 years. Not just the documented cases, all of them. The ones who stayed silent. The ones who left service rather than fight back. The ones like Commander Phillips who couldn't live with what I'd done to them. I told myself I was entitled to their submission because of my rank. I was wrong. I was a predator who used the uniform as camouflage. You stopped me when the system wouldn't. History will remember you as a hero and me as exactly what I am. That's justice. Respectfully, V. Harrington. Elena had read the letter 3 times, trying to determine if it represented genuine remorse or final manipulation by someone whose entire identity had been built on controlling narratives. She still wasn't sure, but it didn't matter. Harrington's psychological state was irrelevant to the changes his conviction had catalyzed. What mattered was that 7 women had justice, that systematic reforms were protecting future personnel from predators who thought rank exempted them from accountability, that the institutional culture was slowly painfully learning that protecting the Brotherhood meant holding criminals responsible, regardless of their service record or political connections. Elena filed the letter without responding. Harrington didn't deserve her forgiveness, and she wasn't interested in providing absolution that would ease his guilt. He could spend the next 25 years contemplating the wreckage of his career and the lives he'd destroyed. That was consequence, not conversation. 2 years after Harrington's conviction, Elena stood at the same shooting range where Colonel Blackwood had briefed her 72 hours before the operation that changed everything. The morning air carried the same autumn bite, the same scent of pine and gunpowder, the same sense of history accumulated in soil that had witnessed centuries of conflict. Blackwood stood beside her, 2 years older, but still carrying himself with the dignity that 47 years of service had etched into his bearing. They'd returned to this place by unspoken agreement, recognizing it as an origin point for transformation that had rippled far beyond individual justice. You remember what you told me that morning? Elena asked, echoing his question from 6 months earlier. I told you a lot of things, Blackwood replied with a slight smile. Which particular wisdom are you referencing? You said that sometimes righteous anger is necessary, that some fights can't be avoided, only prepared for, that walking away from battles you can win means accepting responsibility for battles others will lose. Elena's voice was quiet but steady. You were right, sir. All of it. And I'm grateful you trained me to recognize when walking away wasn't an option. Blackwood studied the target range where Elena had shot perfect groups 2 years earlier, displaying the nervous precision that had told him she was preparing for something dangerous. You know what I've learned in my 47 years of service? That real strength isn't about domination. It's about protection. You protected people who couldn't protect themselves. That's what heroes do. I'm not a hero, sir. I'm just someone who was in the right place with the right training and the right authorization to do what needed doing. That's exactly what makes you a hero, Elena. Heroes are just people who do the necessary thing when it's difficult and dangerous and everyone else is looking away. He paused, then added with characteristic understatement, Admiral Harrington learned that lesson the hard way. Elena smiled, remembering that moment when Harrington's confidence had shattered and she'd seen genuine fear in his eyes for the first time. 3 seconds that's all it took to end 32 years of predatory behavior. 3 seconds from the moment he threw that punch to the moment he hit the floor unconscious. Best 3 seconds of work I've seen in 47 years of training operators, Blackwood said with quiet satisfaction. You executed perfectly. Technique, timing, legal justification, documentation, all of it flawless. I'm proud of you, Elena, not just for stopping Harrington, but for changing the system that protected him. They stood together in silence, 2 warriors who'd fought different battles in different wars, but understood the same fundamental truth, that protecting the vulnerable required courage to stand against the powerful evidence, to survive legal challenge, and willingness to risk everything for justice that seemed impossible until someone made it real. The morning sun broke through the pine branches, casting long shadows across ground where Elena had prepared for confrontation that would define her career and catalyze reforms that would protect countless personnel she'd never meet. She'd walked into conference room Delta 7 alone, armed with nothing but a recording device and 12 years of training. She'd let a predator reveal his true nature. She'd documented evidence that eliminated ambiguity, and when violence became inevitable, she'd ended it with surgical precision that left Harrington unconscious before his bodyguards could intervene. 3 seconds that changed everything. And as Elena returned to her duties training the next generation of warriors who would inherit the transformed institution she'd helped create, she carried the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against foreign enemies, but against internal corruption that threatens everything the uniform represents. Competence earned through skill, respect demanded through action, justice achieved through courage. These were the lessons she taught now, the lessons she'd learned from Blackwood and proved in confrontation with a predator who thought his rank made him invincible. Admiral Victor Harrington had discovered otherwise, and the institution he'd corrupted was learning that accountability transcended rank, that protection meant defending everyone rather than just the powerful, and that real strength came not from domination, but from using whatever capabilities you possessed to ensure that predators faced consequences and victims found justice. The transformation wasn't complete. Cultural change required years rather than months. But momentum had been established. Precedents had been set, and every woman entering military service now did so with confidence that the system would support them against predatory superiors, that reporting misconduct would result in investigation rather than retaliation, and that careers could be built on merit rather than survival of harassment and abuse. Elena had made that possible. Not alone the victims who testified, the investigators who pursued justice, the reformers who changed policies, and all contributed essential elements. But she'd provided the catalyst, the documented evidence that made denial impossible, the proof that predators could be stopped when their targets possessed courage and capability to fight back. As she watched her students practicing techniques that might one day save their lives or protect others who couldn't protect themselves, Elena Thorne understood that this was legacy worth building. Not monuments or medals or recognition, but the simple knowledge that somewhere a woman in uniform was safer because Elena had chosen to fight back when fighting seemed impossible. And that was enough.